Hey guys, tonight we step softly into the candle-lit gloom of a medieval chamber, where the air is heavy with the scent of iron, must, and a low fire crackling in the hearth. Shadows press in close around you, and somewhere out of sight, a metal key glints cool and secretive, like a promise you might not want to keep. You're here for a single infamous question: were chastity belts ever real? Or are we all chasing a myth forged from fear, fantasy, and maybe more than a dash of wishful thinking? In the flicker of your imagination, you can almost hear the clink of metal links and the soft shuffle of slippers on stone. But a warning, this journey is not for the faint of heart or the impatient. If you ever find yourself whisked away to medieval Europe, locked in a room with a trunk marked family honor, you probably won't survive this. At least, not without an awkward conversation with your local locksmith. So, before we drift any deeper, if this hushed little corner brings you even a flicker of calm, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right in your chest. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always midnight somewhere, and I love hearing which corner of the earth you're tuning in from. Now, breathe slow, let the weight fall off your shoulders, and sink with me into tonight's slow unraveling of the past, right here on Historian's Diary. You ease down onto a cold wooden bench, the kind with a little too much history etched into its grain. As the hush of the chamber wraps around you, you begin to pick at the very first threads of the chastity belt legend, a tale tangled up in so many layers of rumor and retelling. You might need a blacksmith's hammer just to crack open the truth. Picture this: it's the late Middle Ages, maybe somewhere in Italy or France. The world is a mess of superstition, suspicion, and spectacular headgear. Amid all the chaos, someone starts whispering about iron devices made to safeguard the virtue of women left behind while their husbands go off to war. You catch the hint of a grin in the darkness, because already the story sounds too convenient, too perfectly shaped to fit the anxieties of a society obsessed with honor and control. But where, really, do these whispers begin? You lean into the oldest chronicles, flipping through yellowed manuscripts by candlelight. The earliest mentions aren't medieval at all. They crop up much later in Renaissance-era books with a taste for the lurid. Some stories reference knights and crusaders. Others reach back to the Romans, who certainly had a flair for drama, but never actually locked anyone in an iron swimsuit. The medieval chroniclers themselves, for all their talk of sin and virtue, are curiously silent. That silence, of course, leaves a gap wide enough for all kinds of imagination to creep in. By the 15th century, you see the first hints of something resembling a chastity belt in European illustrations, sometimes as the butt of a joke, other times as a grim warning. You can almost hear the medieval dinner party conversation. Someone cracks wise about a jealous husband and a padlock, and suddenly, the whole room is clutching their sides and wondering how uncomfortable that would be. But it's not all laughter. The area is shaped by anxieties about lineage and property, about daughters who wander and wives left unattended. You notice how often stories of the belt drift right alongside stories about virtue, temptation, and betrayal. Sometimes you catch the echo of an older, deeper fear, that in a world without paternity tests, trust is a luxury only the rich can afford. Here's your first mainstream historical fact. The word chastity belt doesn't appear in any serious, legal, or ecclesiastical document from the true heart of the Middle Ages. Not once. Not a single law, trial record, or church edict ever commands or even describes the use of these belts. The silence is almost deafening. If you're listening for the clang of metal, you'll only hear the soft turn of a page. But let's be honest, history is a messy business. Sometimes the juiciest stories are born not from what people did, but what they dreamed up late at night, when the wine ran out and the candles guttered low. The chastity belt, you start to suspect, is less about locking up bodies and more about locking down anxiety. Still, you can't shake the image. Iron bands, cruelly tight, tucked under linen and wool. You wonder who might have made such things and why anyone would believe they were ever real. You trace the story forward, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down. Each time you brush your fingers across a dusty folio or a museum display, you're confronted with the same riddle. Are you looking at history or a mirror held up to our deepest fears? Outside, the wind moans against the glass. You realize how easy it is to imagine these devices, even if they never quite existed. Medieval Europe, after all, is a world that thrives on shadows, where every locked door hides a secret and every rumor gains the weight of iron. Somewhere in the darkness, a joke lands. Why did the blacksmith's wife never smile? She was too busy looking for the spare key. You allow yourself a sleepy chuckle. Maybe the real myth here is how much we love a story that lets us laugh and shudder at the same time. As the hour grows late and the shadows deepen, you gather up your courage, ready to follow the legend wherever it leads. The chastity belt's grip on our imaginations is strong, but you're here to test every link. You press on, the stone corridor stretching out before you, each echoing footstep carrying you closer to the crossroads of commerce and curiosity. Picture yourself ducking beneath a striped awning in a bustling medieval marketplace, where the air is sharp with spice, sweat, and the faint tang of hot metal. Here, among the caged songbirds and painted glass beads, you catch the first waft of a new kind of rumor. Merchants have begun whispering about strange contraptions, iron belts for wayward women, so they say. Some offer knowing winks, others trade in sly glances, and nobody seems quite sure whether to believe a word of it. You sidle up to a merchant's table, fingers grazing past bolts of rough cloth and small packets of imported sugar, and overhear the tale as it's told for the 10th time today. A nobleman in Florence, someone claims, ordered 3 belts from Venice, 1 for his wife, 2 for his daughters, all lined with velvet, but locked tight as a miser's purse. The words are heavy with suggestion, and you sense that they hang more in the realm of fantasy than fact. Yet in a world where gossip travels faster than the fastest horse, who's to say where truth ends and embroidery begins? One historical fact stands out as you navigate this tangle. The Middle Ages saw a boom in all manner of protective devices, from plague masks to herbal amulets, sold by opportunists to anyone frightened enough or superstitious enough to part with their coin. Chastity belts, if they ever did appear in any form, would have fit right into this thriving marketplace of anxieties. The merchant's cart, after all, is as much a vehicle for stories as it is for silk or saffron. You pause amused as a sly joke makes its rounds, something about a merchant who forgot the key to his own wife's belt and had to enlist the town's locksmith for a delicate matter. The story always ends with laughter, a shake of the head, and perhaps a quiet glance at the ironmonger's stall, just to check what's really on offer. But behind every joke and tall tale, you feel the deeper currents of fear and fascination. In a society where the boundaries between sin and safety are blurred, every parent, husband, or priest is looking for something, anything that might offer a little control over life's unruly appetites. If you've ever bought garlic for a cold or a lucky rabbit's foot, you get it. The market thrives on the hope that a little bit of metal might solve the messiness of human nature. You peer into the merchant's inventory. There are locks of every size, some delicate enough to fit a diary, others robust enough to bar a castle gate. None are labelled for virtue preservation, but you know that a story, once it takes root, doesn't need physical proof to thrive. All it needs is repetition, a few raised eyebrows, and just enough mystery to keep everyone guessing. Modern scholars will later pore over dusty inventories, finding not a single purchase order for an iron girdle of chastity, but you sense that's missing the point. Stories move faster than paperwork. The mere rumor of such a device is enough to spark panic, titillation, and 1,000 bedtime warnings whispered to daughters across Europe. You lean in, eavesdropping on a pair of matrons haggling over a length of ribbon. Better a belt of iron than a tongue of poison. one quips, earning a round of snickers. You can't help but smile. In every age, there's always someone who'd rather lock up temptation than face it head on. The farther you wander, the more you notice. The myth of the chastity belt spreads like wildfire, leaping from city to city with the merchants who carry it. Sometimes the tale is offered as a caution, stay pure, or this awaits you. Sometimes it's told as comedy, complete with impressions and pantomimes that leave the crowd in stitches. And sometimes it's simply one more rumor added to the heap, to be forgotten the next time the price of pepper rises or a new saint's relic arrives in town. But the story doesn't need to be true to have power. You can almost see the little iron padlocks sparkling in the torchlight, their very presence promising safety, order, and a kind of certainty that the real world never quite delivers. It's the kind of magic trick that merchants have been peddling for centuries. Sell people a solution to the thing they fear most, and they'll never stop coming back for more. As the market square fades behind you, you reflect. Maybe the chastity belt began its life not in a dungeon or a bedroom, but here among the barkers and the banter, where the line between reality and wishful thinking is as thin as a silver chain. You dust the breadcrumbs from your cloak and press onward, following the story wherever it leads, because the next chapter, you suspect, is about to get even wilder. Oh, and here's your required joke for the road. Why did the merchant's wife keep losing her key? Because she knew the locksmith was much more fun at parties. You find yourself wandering a quiet medieval garden, moonlight painting pale stripes across the gravel path. There's a hush in the air, punctuated only by the distant hoot of an owl and the soft shuffle of your own steps. Somewhere beyond the hedges, you can almost hear the clangor of armor, the murmured farewells of wives and sweethearts, and the clatter of horses' hooves as crusaders ride into the unknown. And as you listen, you can't help but ask, did any of these men, noble, pious, or just plain anxious, really lock their beloveds into chastity belts before riding off to Jerusalem? It's the classic image, isn't it? A nervous lord, dreading what mischief might befall in his absence, summons the blacksmith. There's a faintly embarrassed negotiation, a measuring tape, maybe even a prototype or two. By dawn, a gleaming device is presented, a mixture of armor and trap. The wife or daughter or sister, pick your stereotype, is told that her virtue and by extension the family's honor now rests in a cage she must wear until the crusader's safe return. He pockets the only key, tucks it into a pouch along with his rosary beads, and gallops off to seek glory in the Holy Land. But the closer you look at this scene, the more it begins to shimmer and wobble like a mirage. For one thing, consider the reality of medieval travel. Crusades were not a weekend excursion. These expeditions could last for years, sometimes a decade or more. How likely is it that any practical-minded woman, tasked with managing estates, livestock, and the odd attempted robbery, would accept being literally padlocked into iron underwear for such a stretch? You can't help but smirk. Even the most devoted spouse has limits, and no knight's errantry could inspire that level of patience or pain tolerance. Here's your historical anchor for tonight. There is no documented evidence, none, not even a whiff in the vast archives of Crusader correspondence or domestic inventories that supports the idea of knights routinely locking up their womenfolk before setting out. The legend seems to emerge centuries later, in stories and illustrations, eager for drama but short on proof. In fact, many references to this practice don't appear until the Renaissance, when people were already mythologizing the bad old days of medieval life, as if they were a costume drama waiting to happen. Still, the story has legs. You walk among the tapestries and woodcuts, noticing how artists began to play with the idea. There's a famous 16th century German engraving, a woman presented with a key, a knight looking grave, the whole scene dripping with symbolism and not a little sarcasm. The message is clear, trust is fragile, and even the bravest warrior is helpless in the face of jealousy. The real joke, of course, is on the would-be jailers. As you stroll through the garden, you realize that the women left behind were anything but idle. Medieval noblewomen were not shrinking violets. They managed estates, handled finances, negotiated alliances, and occasionally even defended their homes with sword in hand. If anyone had the ingenuity to pick a lock or bribe a blacksmith, it would be them. You pass beneath a heavy arch where the scent of crushed rosemary lingers, and recall another practical matter: personal hygiene, a contraption made of iron or even leather, worn for months or years on end. It's hard enough to keep clean in a drafty stone manor, let alone with medieval plumbing. If the chastity belt ever existed, it would have been a magnet for infection, chafing, and endless complaints to the local healer. Picture a long line of patients all whispering about the rash, while the apothecary tries desperately to keep a straight face. And yet, the Crusader myth persists. Why? Maybe because it's so tidy. It wraps up a host of messy anxieties about trust, fidelity, gender, and power in a neat little package. The story is irresistible, even to those who know better. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, they say. But in medieval Europe, absence also made the imagination run wild. You stop to tie your shoe, or the medieval equivalent, a floppy bit of leather with more laces than sense, and overhear a pair of pages trading stories by torchlight. One swears he's seen a lady locked up for safekeeping. The other snorts and retorts, "My uncle's been locked out of his own pantry for years. Maybe he needs a key too." The laughter ripples into the night, and you're reminded once more how much these tales thrive in the fertile ground of gossip. One of the lightest asides drifts up. You know the real reason knights wore armor, right? To distract everyone from what their wives were up to. It's the kind of joke that would land well in any tavern, medieval or modern. Everyone's in on it, because deep down, nobody really believes the myth, but everyone loves to repeat it. You follow the story as it hops borders and languages, morphing with each retelling. In England, the legend becomes tangled up with tales of Robin Hood and cuckolded husbands. In Italy, it's played for laughs, with Venetian mask makers rumoured to craft special keys for the city's most illustrious ladies. In France, the ceinture de Chastity becomes a metaphor for courtly love, desirable but ultimately impossible to enforce. And so you meander, weaving between truth and tall tale, learning that the Crusaders' absence was less a catalyst for ironclad inventions, and more an excuse for a society to air its private fears. The belt itself, in all likelihood, remained imaginary, a ghost conjured up whenever fidelity seemed too fragile to trust. It's tempting to imagine what might have happened if a real knight had tried it. Picture the scene. The key, misplaced after a particularly raucous night at the local tavern, is discovered by the family dog, who buries it in the garden for safekeeping. Weeks later, an enterprising chicken unearths it, and, well, the rest is lost to history. Or maybe not lost. Maybe it's right there in the next outrageous rumor making its way through the grapevine. You pause to rest on a low wall, watching fireflies flicker above a pond. The water's surface is as smooth as glass, reflecting 1,000 stars and one very skeptical historian. If there's a moral to this chapter, it's that people will believe almost anything if it helps them make sense of the world, or gives them something new to whisper about in the dark. And before you rise to wander on, why did the Crusader's wife start a locksmith's guild? She figured, if she was going to be locked up, she might as well own the keys. The night draws deeper, and the garden seems both more mysterious and more familiar. You carry with you the echo of hoofbeats, the clink of imaginary keys, and the certainty that the next twist in the legend will be even stranger than the last. You leave the moonlit garden and step into a different kind of darkness, a smithy flickering with firelight and heavy with the smell of scorched iron. If the Crusader myth was all about anxiety and absence, then this is where fantasy meets engineering, the forge of the chastity belt. The door swings shut behind you with a clang, and your eyes adjust to the smoky glow. You watch as a blacksmith hammers at a strip of metal, sweat running down his brow, the rhythm of his mallet nearly hypnotic. You wonder, what kind of craftsman would actually design something so personal, so peculiar, and so likely to end up the punchline of a joke centuries later? Let's set the scene. In the medieval mind, a good blacksmith could do almost anything: mend a plough, shoe a horse, fix the family heirloom, even whip up a helmet for the lord's nephew who fancied himself a jouster. But to forge a chastity belt, that's something else entirely, a task that blends practical skill with, frankly, an odd sense of humour. You imagine a local noble leaning in close, voice low, requesting something to keep the household safe. The blacksmith, always eager for a challenge and maybe a good story for the tavern later, raises an eyebrow and asks for details. You step closer, peering at the workbench. There are tools for every purpose: tongs, files, rivets, keys. Some are delicate, meant for the thin work of jewellery. Others are sturdy and rough, perfect for repairing a broken hinge. In this atmosphere, the line between security device and status symbol starts to blur. If the chastity belt was ever truly made, it would have been a masterpiece of craftsmanship, at least in theory. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ponder while you stand in the glow. In the rare surviving examples of so-called chastity belts from museums, the majority date from the 16th century or later. Most, upon close inspection, turn out to be Victorian creations, crafted less for medieval necessity than for sensational exhibitions. The real medieval blacksmiths, their ledgers are suspiciously empty of iron underpants commissions, but the legend had legs, and so did the occasional display piece, sometimes made centuries after the Middle Ages had faded into memory. Still, you can't resist imagining how such an object might have come to be. Maybe it started as a dare, or as a joke at a feast gone on too long. Let's see if old Bertrand can make a girdle that even the cleverest squire can't unfasten. Laughter, a few too many cups of mead, and suddenly the challenge is accepted. You picture Bertrand the blacksmith sketching out designs on a scrap of parchment, surrounded by sniggering onlookers and scandalized servants. The engineering questions pile up almost immediately. How would you make it secure but not so tight as to injure? What kind of lock could withstand prying fingers? And more importantly, which key would be safest hidden and where? If you really wanted a foolproof device, you'd have to factor in comfort or the lack thereof, daily life, the need to use the privy, and all the awkward realities of the human body. The more you think about it, the more the idea of a practical chastity belt seems absurd. Yet the stories persist, passed down like family recipes for disaster. You notice something peculiar in the smithy's corner, a battered chest filled with odds and ends. You rummage through it, finding bits of broken armor, links of chainmail, an old padlock, and a set of keys that clearly don't match anything in sight. Maybe that's the real story here. Medieval life was messy, improvisational, and nobody ever had the right key for the right lock. While you're lost in this sea of scrap metal, a local nobleman stops by. He's red-faced and slightly tipsy, complaining about household security. You can't tell if he's worried about actual thieves or just the neighborhood gossip. He eyes the blacksmith's handiwork, offers a few coins, and asks for something innovative. The smith obliges, fashioning a belt not out of necessity but out of a desire to impress or amuse the local lord. Perhaps it's a gag, a piece to display at feasts and provoke laughter. After all, nothing delights a crowd like the pretense of scandal. This brings you to the spectacle of the chastity belt. Even if never worn in earnest, such a device could become a showpiece, passed around at gatherings, dangled from the wall of the great hall, or used to poke fun at rival families. You can hear the laughter now. Careful, or Lady Marjorie will fit you with one of these. Cue a round of raucous guffaws and the sound of tankards slamming on the table. In a world where public shame is a favorite pastime, the mere existence of such an object, real or imagined, serves as both warning and entertainment. You look closer at the device in progress. Thick bands of iron, awkwardly jointed, too heavy for practical use. If anything, it seems designed less for comfort or safety, and more for the spectacle. Maybe it's even a prop, something to display in the town square as a symbol of virtue or a reminder to behave. You think of other medieval oddities, the scold's bridle, the ducking stool, the stocks, all real instruments of public discipline, but rarely used as often as legend suggests. The chastity belt fits right into this tradition, more about making a statement than solving an actual problem. Yet even as you examine the craftsmanship, the doubts linger. How many belts were actually made? Were they really meant to be worn, or just paraded for show? The evidence is thin, like the last dregs of wine in a dusty goblet. Most so-called medieval examples, when subjected to modern analysis, turn out to have 19th century rivets, Victorian locks, or even hidden hinges for easy demonstration. If you're searching for proof, you're more likely to find it in a cabinet of curiosities than in the pages of a medieval diary. But the imagination is a powerful tool, and so you linger in the smithy, pondering what it says about a society that could invent such a device. If only in legend, the blacksmith, finished with his task, wipes his brow and presents his latest creation, a belt that clangs with every step, impractical, uncomfortable, and ultimately unnecessary. You thank him for the demonstration, drop a coin in his hand, and slip back into the night, the sound of laughter still ringing in your ears. And just before you go, a final joke. Why did the blacksmith refuse to make a second chastity belt? He'd already lost the key to the first one, and his wife hadn't let him live it down since. The night air is cool on your face as you step away from the firelight, and you realize the story of the locksmith's craft is less about security and more about spectacle. In a world obsessed with appearances, sometimes the appearance of control is all that really matters. You move on, the echoes of hammer and anvil fading behind you, and wonder what other myths and machinations you'll uncover in the next shadowy corner of history. You're drifting now through the corridors of old manor houses, past tapestries and candlelit halls, where every surface is thick with stories, some whispered, some shouted, all tangled in the hush of centuries. Tonight, your footsteps are lighter, yet there's a weight to the topic that keeps you curious and just a little wary. What did the chastity belt mean to the people who believed in it? Was it, as the more dramatic tales suggest, a cruel tool of control, a metal prison for the body and spirit? Or was it, as some wry chroniclers hinted, just an elaborate symbol, a sort of medieval joke gone uncomfortably far? You find yourself peeking into a dim chamber, heavy velvet drapes drawn tight. On the bed, an ornate iron object lies half hidden beneath a lace-edged camise. You imagine the scene. A woman alone, the glow of embers painting patterns across the wall, her hand resting on cold metal. The stories say these belts were instruments of suffering, designed to guard virtue by making every movement a torment. They speak of chafed skin, bruised hips, and the constant dread of not being able to answer nature's call. But as you draw closer, you realize the picture isn't so simple. Every legend is a mirror, and the faces peering back at you are full of questions, not answers. Let's slow down and pick at the edges of fact and fable. Mainstream history offers a guiding lantern. There are no reliable records, no court documents, no medical treatises, no private diaries from the actual medieval period that describe women suffering long-term in these devices. Sure, you'll find a few scandalous stories from later centuries written by men with a flair for exaggeration and a keen eye for what sells. The grim tales of wounds and weeping, locked doors and lost keys, most trace back to the Victorian era, when a taste for gothic horror and moral panic reached its peak. By then, chastity belts had become a favourite prop for both the prudish and the prurient. But imagine for a moment what it would be like if even one of those stories were true. Picture a young bride, her new husband far away on business or at war, and the weight of the household pressing in on her. There's a sharp awareness of eyes, servants, neighbours, priests, watching, judging, always ready to gossip. The belt becomes more than metal. It's a badge of suspicion, a message writ large. You are not trusted. You are not your own. If such a thing was ever worn in earnest, it was surely as much a mental burden as a physical one. Yet here comes the twist. You notice how many of the legends also trade in comfort and reassurance. Some belts, so the stories claim, were lined with soft cloth, padded at the hips, adorned with little locks shaped like hearts. The key wasn't always in the husband's pocket. Sometimes it was kept by the woman herself, or shared with a trusted servant. Maybe, in the softer versions of the story, the belt is a token of faith. See, I am true, even when you are gone. It's a far cry from the more lurid visions of agony and confinement. In a quiet alcove, you come upon a group of young women, maids and daughters, playing a game with a fake lock and an old length of chain. They tease one another, giggling, sometimes pantomiming the damsel in distress routine, sometimes rolling their eyes at the idea of any man believing he could truly control their hearts or their bodies. The room fills with laughter, and you realize that for many, the chastity belt is more punchline than prison. Even the harshest stories are softened by time, by humor, by the knowledge that life always finds a way to slip past the tightest bonds. Still, the legend persists. You move down a corridor lined with portraits, each face frozen in time. Some wear expressions of solemn dignity, others the hint of a secret smile. You wonder how many of them heard the tales, how many repeated them to wide-eyed children, how many dismissed them as nonsense. Yet every generation seems to rediscover the belt, dust off the myth, and try it on for size, usually with a mix of horror and fascination. Let's anchor this stroll with another historical fact. In the records of actual medieval punishments, you'll find plenty of cruel devices, pillories, iron masks, even the infamous brank for scolds. But chastity belts are conspicuously absent. They belong more to the world of fairy tales and satire than to the grim annals of real suffering. It's telling, isn't it, that the most vivid depictions come from artists and writers, not from those who lived through the Middle Ages themselves. You duck into a library, candlelight dancing across a heap of illuminated manuscripts. You thumb through a collection of bawdy poems, many from Renaissance Venice and Paris, where poets had a field day lampooning jealous husbands and meddling mothers-in-law. One verse describes a belt so tight it could squeeze a song from a stone. Another suggests the key is kept not by the husband but by a clever lover, hidden in a cake or tied to a pet dog's collar. It's all absurd, and the laughter rings through the centuries. Satire, after all, is a way of pricking the balloon of fear and control, reminding everyone that love, like water, finds its way around every obstacle. Here's another joke that's made its rounds. Why did the lady of the manor ask for 2 keys? One for the belt and one for the wine cellar. Guess which one's harder to open? You smile, picturing the sly glances exchanged behind fans, the conspiratorial winks, the games that never quite end, but there are darker undertones as well. In some retellings, the chastity belt is wielded not as reassurance, but as punishment, an answer to suspected infidelity, a tool to shame and isolate. These stories have more in common with the scold's bridle or the stocks than with any real effort to preserve chastity. Here, the belt becomes a symbol of the ways societies have tried to control women's bodies, to police desire and autonomy. Yet even in these tales, the device is rarely real. It's a stand-in, a metaphor, a way of turning fear into something you can touch and see. You make your way to the kitchens, where a gaggle of servants are gossiping around a bubbling cauldron. The head cook, famous for her sharp tongue, declares, "If men spent half as much time trusting as they do locking things up, we'd all be better fed." The maids erupt in laughter, and you can't help but agree. The real secret, it seems, is that no lock, however clever, can keep out suspicion or guarantee faithfulness or solve the mysteries of the heart. You step outside for a moment, a cool air brushing your face. Above, the stars wheel in slow silence. You reflect on all you've seen, the belt as joke, as threat, as symbol of love or cruelty, and always, in the background, the knowledge that its power comes not from iron or keys, but from the stories people choose to tell. Perhaps that's the greatest truth of all. Control is often an illusion, but the things we fear and the things we hope for have a way of becoming real, if only in our minds. Before you head on, here's one last chuckle. Why did the town crier refuse to announce the lost chastity belt key? Because he knew some secrets are best left locked away. The manor sleeps now, the candles guttering low. You pull your cloak tighter, already feeling the pull of the next chapter. one that will lead you out of bedrooms and back into the boisterous world of satire and spectacle, where the chastity belt sheds its iron for a new kind of armor, the laughter and disbelief of generations to come. You're whisked from the hush of bedchambers into a world awash with laughter, wordplay, and the sly wink of a performer's eye. The door swings open, and you find yourself on a cobbled Venetian street, not in the shadowy corners of suspicion, but under the bright lanterns of carnival. It's the Renaissance now, an age when stories are spun from silk and satire is as sharp as any rapier that struts across the stage of farce, lampooned in poetry, pantomime, and even painting. You settle in somewhere between audience and participant to witness how a simple iron device was transformed into the butt of Europe's grandest jokes. Picture the scene. A masked actor strides across the planks of a raucous theatre, a ludicrous metal contraption clanking around his waist. The crowd roars as he mimics a jealous husband, parading his new invention, a chastity belt said to be proof against all temptation. There are double takes, dramatic sobs, and the endless jingle of keys. The punchline is always the same. No matter how clever the lock, someone, often the wife herself, has already found a way out. It's a farce that never grows old. You realize quickly that the chastity belt for most Renaissance minds was never about real suffering, but about exposing the absurdity of suspicion and the futility of trying to police desire. Poets, especially in Venice and Paris, turned these tales into sly verses. The legendary Pietro Aretino, who knew a thing or two about scandal, penned stanzas poking fun at husbands who trusted more in iron than in love. Satirical engravings began to circulate, women holding keys behind their backs, locksmiths winking at the audience, amorous priests handing out spare keys under the confessional's shadow. In each, the joke's true target is never the woman, it's the man who thinks he can outwit fate with a padlock. Here's your historical fact for this stroll down the carnival lane. The Renaissance was an era obsessed with cleverness, riddles, and reversals. The chastity belt fit right into this mood, a symbol of human folly, not of actual practice. Writers and artists used it as shorthand for over-the-top jealousy, or as a metaphor for the endless game between freedom and control. Even the best-known literary references are tinged with disbelief. In Rabelais's Gargantua and Pantagruel, there's mention of an iron belt, but only as a source of ridicule. The character's wife, of course, is never actually trapped. You find yourself swept along with the crowd, out of the theatre and into the noisy squares, where vendors hawk toy belts alongside candied almonds and masks. A juggler tosses a set of comically oversized keys. A group of children try them on for fun, giggling as they chase one another in circles. It dawns on you that the chastity belt's power here is purely symbolic. Its presence deflates fear, turns suspicion into spectacle, and invites everyone to laugh at the idea that anyone, anywhere could truly guard love with iron. A group of poets in the corner debate which is more ridiculous, the jealous husband or the neighbor who pretends never to notice. One declaims, "Give me 1,000 locks, and still my lady's eyes would find the key." They raise their cups in a toast, laughter bubbling over, while the subject of their verse, virtue, chastity, fidelity, floats away on a tide of satire. In these stories, the chastity belt is never a successful tool of control. It's always the prelude to a punchline or a lesson in humility. The paintings from this era reflect the same playful skepticism. In the studio of a minor master, you spot an unfinished work. A beautiful woman, one hand on her hip, the other dangling a tiny key. The would-be jailer, drawn as a foppish lord, wrings his hands in the background, while the dog at the woman's feet yawns, clearly in on the joke. There's no menace here, only amusement, and a wink that transcends centuries. But satire is a double-edged sword. You wander into a salon where thinkers and witmongers gather to debate love, loyalty, and all the foolish ways humans try to regulate them. The conversation turns half serious, half jesting, to the lengths men will go to ensure what can never truly be ensured. Someone pipes up, "What's more faithful than a chastity belt?" The answer comes quick, an unlocked door and a trusting heart. The laughter is loud, but there's a softness to it, a kind of world-weary acceptance that love in the end is not something you can lock away. You remember a story told in Florence, where a clever artisan fashioned a chastity belt for the mayor's famously flirtatious wife. On the day it was presented, the entire city gathered to see the spectacle, but as the key was handed over, a dozen other keys, each carved from wood, bone, or even bread, tumbled out from the hems and sleeves of the assembled guests. The mayor's face turned red as a pomegranate. The city, it said, laughed for a week. Even the artist joined in, sketching the scene on scraps of parchment for posterity. Jokes like these traveled well, spreading from city to city, adapting to every local flavor. In Paris, the chastity belt became part of the commedia dell'arte, a running gag for every stock character: the jealous Pantalone, the crafty Colombina, the clueless Il Dottore. Each new troupe found ways to update the device. Sometimes a belt, sometimes a chest, sometimes just an overabundance of locks. The effect was always the same: suspicion is silly, trust is better, and human ingenuity will always win out. Even outside the theatres, the motif bled into everyday conversation. Tailors joked about sewing secret pouches for keys, bakers left tiny padlocks in their loaves, and locksmiths carved hearts into every new creation. You sensed the chastity belt's legend taking on a life of its own, not as a tool of repression, but as a way to laugh at the world's anxieties. And isn't that a kind of freedom in itself? A poet, older and wiser, pulls you aside as the revelry dies down. It's all a game, he says quietly. Love, loyalty, jealousy. The belt is only ever as strong as the trust behind it. And trust, my friend, is the only key that matters. For good measure, here's tonight's running joke. Why did the locksmith's daughter keep a spare key in her garter? Because you never know when you'll need a quick getaway or a new suitor. Still, even as the laughter fades, you notice a subtle shift in the crowd. Beneath the surface, satire reveals its sharp teeth. The jokes about control and trust, about keys and locks, hint at deeper worries about autonomy, about the balance of power between men and women, about the impossibility of truly knowing another's heart. The chastity belt as a punchline becomes a way for people to talk about things that would otherwise be too heavy to name. You leave the carnival behind, stepping back into the silent, starlit streets. The city's laughter echoes in your ears, and you realize that the chastity belt's greatest legacy isn't in the iron or the key, but in the endless play of satire and story. Through mockery and wit, whole generations found a way to handle their fears, to poke fun at their follies, and to remind themselves that life is far too strange and far too short to take entirely seriously. With the moon high and the cobblestones cooling beneath your feet, you carry on. The farce has ended, but the story, you sense, is far from over. You move forward, away from the echoing laughter of Renaissance jesters and poets, into the dim marble halls of museums, places where legends are polished behind glass, and every object claims a story. Here, under the watchful gaze of security lights and silent docents, the chastity belt has found a second life. You slow your step and draw near the most curious exhibit of all, the so-called genuine medieval chastity belt, rusted and severe, locked tight as a miser's vault. It's a favorite for field trips and nervous giggles, a tangible link to a wilder, darker past. But as you stand there, you can't help but ask, is this artifact truly medieval, or is it a masterwork of later fakery, crafted for a public hungry for spectacle? Let's begin with a little sleight of hand. Most chastity belts displayed in European museums, especially the most famous examples from Vienna, Paris, and London, are not medieval at all. The truth is almost comical in its mundanity. Most of these objects now behind glass were actually manufactured in the 19th century. Victorians, for all their prudishness, loved a good scandalous relic. The darker and more outlandish, the better. These medieval belts were often fabricated to satisfy the morbid curiosity of a public enthralled by tales of knights, damsels, and the steamy dangers lurking in every shadowed corridor of history. As you lean in, you notice the details that betray these clever fakes. The locks are stamped with mass-produced hallmarks, the iron has been acid-etched to mimic the passage of centuries, and even the hinges are suspiciously modern, designed for display, not endurance. You catch a curator, tired but game, answering yet another schoolchild's question about how anyone could go to the bathroom. With a tired smile, she explains, for the 100th time, that these were likely never meant for actual use. You're reminded of a basic rule of history. If something seems both cruel and impractical, it's probably a story first, an object second. But why did the Victorians fall so hard for the chastity belt myth? To answer that, you slip into the world of 19th century Europe, a place obsessed with the dangerous female body, the frailty of virtue, and the supposed savagery of the medieval world. Nothing delighted Victorian collectors more than a gruesome object with a racy backstory. So blacksmiths, museum suppliers, and entrepreneurs obliged, churning out medieval belts by the dozen. They were sold to tourists, gifted to heads of state, and displayed at world's fairs as cautionary tales about the supposed barbarism of earlier times. You wander from display to display, and the irony becomes inescapable. The real chastity belt, if such a thing ever existed, has been lost or perhaps never even made. What we have instead is an industry of fakes, each one telling us more about the people who built them than the people they pretend to represent. The Victorians, with their fretful morals and love of spectacle, needed the chastity belt to be real, even if they had to forge it themselves. There's a sly humour here. The great museums of Europe are filled with objects that are as much about wishful thinking as they are about truth. You peer into a glass case and spot a label, medieval chastity belt. KM100 provenance uncertain. The provenance uncertain is a polite way of saying, we found this in a box. Nobody really knows where it's from, but doesn't it look dramatic? You imagine the meetings where curators debated whether to display it, weighing public appetite for scandal against their professional dignity. You suspect the appetite for scandal usually wins. Another historical fact glimmers in the lamplight. Genuine medieval inventories from the 1300s and 1400s make no mention of chastity belts. Not in the ledgers of noble households, not in legal records, not in church archives. The absence is thunderous. Yet these relics keep popping up in Germany and France, in Britain, always with suspiciously modern touches, always too perfectly preserved for a world without central heating or dry basements. You circle a display in the British Museum, where an especially ornate example has pride of place. School children jostle for a look, daring one another to read the plaque aloud. This, the text intones, was believed to prevent infidelity during long absences. You almost expect the exhibit to wink at you. If it could talk, it might say, I was made for a Victorian's parlour, not a medieval lady's boudoir. Still, the myth persists, feeding a public hunger for the macabre and the bizarre. You stroll through museum gift shops where chastity belt keychains and miniature replicas sell briskly to tourists. Some laugh, some blush, and a few buy them as guaranteed fidelity charms for partners back home. The story has become a product, a souvenir of a world that never quite existed, proof that the best legends are the ones you can take home in your pocket. You chat with a museum guide who admits that the chastity belt is a curator's dream and a historian's headache. People want stories, she shrugs. It doesn't really matter if they're true. The more outrageous, the better. You think about that as you pass a rack of audio guides. How many listeners will walk away convinced that medieval women hobbled around in iron underwear, never knowing that the truth is far more complicated, and in its own way, more interesting? But not everyone is fooled. Some museums, wary of perpetuating myths, quietly label their chastity belts as objects of uncertain origin, or tuck them away in the archives. A few, braver than most, stage exhibitions revealing the real story that these devices were mostly 19th century curiosities, products of a time obsessed with both sex and self-restraint. The response is always mixed. Some visitors feel cheated, Others delighted by the debunking, most just nod and move on, content with their mental picture of dungeons, keys, and secret rendezvous. And here comes tonight's museum joke. Why did the curator refuse to wear the chastity belt at the staff party? Because the lock was made in 1890 and the key's still missing. You step into a quiet corner, away from the crowds, and reflect on what these medieval relics really tell us. They're proof of our deep desire for simple, shocking explanations, evidence perhaps that we're all a little addicted to scandal, even when it comes in the form of cold, unyielding iron. We want the world to have been stranger, rougher, more dramatic than it was, maybe because the real history of trust, doubt, love, and laughter is harder to put behind glass. You pause for a moment, letting the hum of the museum settle around you. The chastity belt, real or not, is now part of our shared imagination, an artifact not just of iron and leather, but of the stories we tell, the fears we nurse, and the jokes we share. Its true home isn't in the display case, but in the minds of all who come looking for a glimpse of the wild, untamed Middle Ages. As you prepare to leave, you pass a final display, a reproduction of a medieval bedroom, complete with mannequins dressed in period costume. On the table sits a chastity belt, gleaming, ominous, and unmistakably modern. The plaque reads, "A symbol of control, suspicion, and the power of myth." You can't help but smile. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that ask you to look a little closer, to question what you're seeing, and just maybe to laugh at your own willingness to believe. With that, you step back out into the fresh air, the clamour of the museum fading behind you, and set off for the next chapter, where the mechanics of fantasy will be tested by the harsh light of reason. You slip out from the echo of museum galleries into a world that's even less forgiving, the world of bodies and mechanics. For a moment, you're no longer a spectator but a test pilot, confronted with the plain and peculiar question that nobody at the Victorian World's Fair ever dared to answer. Could anyone actually wear a chastity belt? How would it work, really? You catch yourself grinning, a little nervous, as you peer at the contraption on a wooden table before you. Bands of cold iron, an awkward set of hinges, a lock that looks like it would be more at home on a horse stall than on a person. You wonder, not for the first time, how myth and metal could ever have crossed paths in the untidy business of real breathing life. Let's be honest, the idea is so outlandish, you almost want to root for it just for the drama. But bodies, you realize, have a way of defying fantasy. Even before you try it on for size, mentally, of course, the flaws jump out. For starters, there's the fit. No two people are built exactly alike. One person's snug is another's torture. Even armourers making breastplates and greaves for knights had to custom fit every piece, and they weren't covering the bits that needed daily attention. Now, take the classic belt shape. A metal band for the waist, a plate or strap running between the legs, usually with a hole of sorts for, shall we say, essential bodily functions. You picture a medieval lady trying to walk, sit, or even mount a horse with this thing buckled on. The chafing alone would be enough to send anyone running for the hills, or the apothecary with a very awkward explanation. Here's a historical fact worth keeping in your pocket as you inspect the device. Not a single verifiable medieval account mentions the everyday problems, rashes, wounds, infections, or even deaths that such a device would inevitably cause if worn for days or weeks. Think of all the surviving complaints about shoes, corsets, and rough linen, and then ask yourself, would a society that wrote love poetry about a well-fitting glove really tolerate something so fundamentally uncomfortable? The next obstacle is hygiene. Life in the Middle Ages was not exactly fragrant at the best of times, but even so, people managed basic cleanliness, chamber pots, public baths, a brisk rinse in a cold stream. With a chastity belt, all that gets complicated fast. The access holes, if present, are never large enough for reality. The Victorian-era replicas, allegedly made from authentic designs, are, without exception, either impractically tiny or so large they defeat the entire purpose. You imagine a medieval washerwoman, her hands chapped from lye, taking one look and saying, "Not in my wash job, thank you." It's here, in the messy, unpredictable mechanics of human life, that the chastity belt story starts to unravel. No real device, worn for days or months, could escape the consequences. Sores, infections, even fatal sepsis. If they'd been widely used, the records of doctors, midwives, or even the more gossipy chroniclers would be full of complaints. Instead, you find silence. You test the device with your hands, rattling the lock, moving the plate. It's heavy, even if made of leather, as some late stories suggest. The thing is stiff, hot, and let's be honest, utterly impractical. Your mind wanders to those ancient suits of armor, famously tailored and expensive. Knights wore them for hours, sometimes a day at most, but never longer. And yet, the chastity belt myth wants you to believe women wore theirs for weeks or years. A joke bubbles up, one told by a bored apprentice. Why did the blacksmith's wife ask for extra padding in her belt? Because she planned on winning the maypole dance. It gets a groan every time, but also a knowing nod. If such devices had ever really been used, you suspect the joke would have been replaced by a lawsuit, or at least a rather heated argument with the local physician. Of course, the more you scrutinize the device, the more you spot its other mechanical failings. Most locks are easy to pick, especially by anyone with a little patience and a hairpin. In some museum pieces, the locks are non-functional. The belt's held together with simple rivets that could be pried open by anyone with a spoon and a little motivation. The whole premise, the lone key held by the jealous husband, is pure theatre. You remember a Renaissance pamphlet that joked about the locksmith's secret side business making duplicate keys for trustworthy friends. The pamphlet's tone is light, but the meaning is clear. In any age, people will find a way around the rules, especially when the rules are this ridiculous. But what about the rare cases when a belt-like device did appear? Scholars sometimes point to a handful of artifacts labeled chastity belts from the late 15th or early 16th century. Most are found in the context of medicine or punishment, not marriage. These devices, awkward, painful, and sometimes deliberately cruel, were likely meant for very short-term restraint, usually as a public humiliation or a cautionary tale, not as a day-to-day safeguard for the family honor. You're reminded of the infamous Skull's Bridle, another iron device, this one meant to silence women accused of gossip or nagging. Even that notorious tool was rarely used, and almost never for long. The records that do exist make it clear the physical and psychological damage was profound, the public outcry real. If chastity belts had been a staple of medieval marriage, the evidence would be everywhere. Let's not forget the engineering. Metalwork in the Middle Ages was an art, but also expensive and labor-intensive. The notion of mass-producing chastity belts for everyday use is, frankly, absurd. Every piece would need to be fitted, adjusted, and if worn for more than a day, repaired and cleaned regularly. A busy blacksmith had better things to do, repairing plows, forging weapons, making horseshoes. You doubt many would risk their reputation and their other business for such a dubious commission. Still, the stories persist. You picture a frazzled scribe, desperate for a good story, inventing a belt of iron for a tale about the dangers of leaving wives unattended, or maybe a satirist, poking fun at the absurdity of marital suspicion. The device moves from joke to rumor to relic, and eventually lands behind glass in a museum where the story is retold with every field trip and guided tour. You imagine a group of university students, centuries later, debating the physics of the belt over coffee. One suggests it might have been possible if the woman never sat down. Another points out that any determined person would simply file the lock off, or bribe the local smith. A third chimes in, why did medieval women never wear chastity belts on market day? Because you can't bargain for apples if you can't bend down. It's all very silly, but that's the point. The further you move from the world of myth and into the world of real bodies, the less sense the chastity belt makes. Its success as a story is precisely because it was never meant to be practical. It's a fantasy about control, a metal answer to the timeless, uncomfortable question of trust. You lean against a wall, the device growing heavier in your hand, and let your thoughts drift. If the chastity belt ever did exist, it lived not in the world of women, but in the world of men's anxieties. It's a symptom of a particular kind of insecurity, one that would rather believe in impossible solutions than face the messiness, love and longing. In this way, the belt is like any superstition, more about the people who fear than the people they fear for. Here's tonight's closing joke. Why did the locksmith retire early? He got tired of making keys for locks nobody actually needed. The light fades as you leave the workshop, the chastity belt left behind, an artifact of what people once wished was true, rather than what was. You step into the night, the cool air a relief after the cramped world of myth and metal, and set your course for the next revelation, because, as you've learned, the real story is rarely about the artifact itself, but about the dreams and nightmares that gave it shape. You emerge from the practical world of iron and anatomy, and step straight into the echoing nave of a medieval cathedral, sunlight slanting through stained glass, catching on 1,000 floating motes of dust. This is where ideas become rules, and rules become rumors. You lower your voice as you cross the threshold, because you know the church is always listening. And the church in the Middle Ages held more sway over love, marriage and virtue than any blacksmith or jealous husband ever could. If the chastity belt belonged anywhere, you'd think it would be here, nestled among sermons and scriptures, a tool for shaping not just bodies but souls. Yet as you make your way down the aisle, you sense the paradox. The chastity belt, the ultimate symbol of enforced purity, doesn't fit comfortably with the actual doctrines and day-to-day practices of the medieval church. You slide into a wooden pew, its surface polished by centuries of anxious hands, and consider the question, did religious authorities ever really endorse, encourage, or even mention the chastity belt as a tool of moral control? The answer, as it so often is with history, is both more complicated and far more interesting than the legends suggest. You scan the grand pillars and listen for echoes, but in the official records of the church, the silence is almost deafening. There are papal bulls about marriage, courtly love, the dangers of lust, the sanctity of fidelity, but nowhere is there an edict, sermon, or even a strongly worded letter advocating the locking up of women in iron devices. In fact, the church's real power was subtler. It lay in shaping hearts and minds, in ritual and confession, in whispered admonitions and public penance, not in the clang of keys and locks. Here's your historical anchor for this candlelit chapter. While the church wielded enormous influence over sexual norms and expectations, its approach was focused on the spiritual, not the mechanical. There were sermons on purity, tales of saints resisting temptation, and strict rules about marriage. But the idea of locking up a woman's body to safeguard her soul would have seemed not only foreign, but bordering on blasphemy. After all, the church taught that virtue was a matter of will, not of welded iron. You wander to the side chapel, where confessionals stand in shadow. Here, the currency is guilt, and the business is absolution. Women and men alike knelt on worn cushions and poured out their doubts and failures, trusting the priest to help them navigate the rocky path between sin and salvation. If a young wife confessed to impure thoughts, her penance might be a week of fasting, a string of prayers, or a donation to the poor, never the imposition of a literal lock and key. Still, the idea of the chastity belt had a certain irresistible logic. In a society haunted by suspicion, where lineage meant inheritance, and inheritance meant power, it's not hard to imagine anxious fathers or husbands daydreaming about such a device. But the leap from fantasy to practice was never sanctioned by the church. Even the most controlling confessors preferred to wield shame and social pressure, not locksmith's tools. You pause at a pillar adorned with faded frescoes. One image shows Saint Agnes, her hands folded in prayer, a dragon curled at her feet. Agnes was the patron saint of virgins. Her power lay in her unwavering will, not in physical constraints. The message is clear. Real purity in the medieval worldview came from inner strength, not from external bonds. You recall a joke whispered among altar boys. Why did the bishop carry a spare key, in case he locked himself out of his own virtue? The boys would snicker, then quickly cross themselves. Even here, the real power was in the mind, not the metal. You reflect on the role of the church in shaping sexual morality. Its real tools were the pulpit, the confessional, the feast and fast, the feast day sermons warning of the dangers of desire. Through ritual and repetition, the church taught that the stakes of chastity and fidelity were cosmic, not carnal. Eternal souls, not just worldly reputations, were on the line. In the cathedral's archive, a cool, silent room lined with manuscripts, you search for any evidence, any reference, any hint that the hierarchy truly endorsed or even acknowledged the use of chastity belts. You find none, not in the lengthy penitentials manuals for confessors, not in the letters of bishops, not in the minutes of church councils. The very idea, you sense, would have struck them as crude, even superstitious. And here's another facet of the myth. When chastity belts do appear in church records or sermons, it's almost always as metaphor. Priests and preachers spoke of the girdle of chastity, but they meant prayer, discipline, the armor of faith. One French preacher urged his flock to lock your heart with the key of virtue and let no sin enter. No mention of actual locks, only the poetry of self-control. It's a subtle difference, but a telling one. In the Middle Ages, the line between body and soul was both blurred and absolute. The church believed the soul could rule the body through discipline, prayer, and sacrament. To rely on iron would be to admit defeat, a confession that the soul had lost its sovereignty. You can almost hear the disapproval in the stony silence of the nave. The church wanted people to believe, not to barricade. As you slip out of the pew and wander toward the exit, you catch a final bit of gossip from two old men by the door. One claims to have seen a belt of chastity in his youth, worn by a distant cousin's wife. The other raises an eyebrow and mutters, "If that's true, I'll eat my hat after I've locked up my own tongue." They laugh, and you see that even here, at the heart of medieval piety, the chastity belt is a legend, one best told with a wink. Your final stop is a chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary, whose story is the ultimate ideal of purity. You kneel for a moment and realize the real chastity belt was always spiritual, always a matter of intention and self-discipline. The church built rituals and traditions to shape behavior, but left the heavy lifting to the conscience and the will. And so, you step back into the daylight, the great doors of the cathedral closing behind you. The church, for all its influence, never locked anyone up. Not in the way the legend suggests. It wielded different tools, softer and more powerful. Words, rituals, the gentle pressure of community. You walk away, grateful that at least in this respect, the truth is lighter than the myth. You glance back one more time and a final joke drifts through your mind. Why did the monk refuse to buy a chastity belt? Because he knew that real temptation starts in the heart, not at the hips. The bells ring, the pigeons scatter, and you are on your way again, ready to follow the chastity belt as it weaves through law courts and legends, always a few steps ahead of the truth, always clinking in the background of history's great debates. You push open the door of the cathedral and drift straight into the chilly chambers of power places where law and order are hammered out, one dusty record at a time. The stone corridors are lined with scrolls and ledgers, each page a snapshot of some forgotten quarrel, some worry about reputation or inheritance. It's here, among the notaries, clerks, and men in heavy robes, that the myths of the chastity belt come up against the sharp reality of laws, legends, and the meticulous paperwork of medieval bureaucracy. Tonight you comb through these records by candlelight, searching for hard evidence. Was the chastity belt ever ordered, enforced, or even mentioned in any legal case, trial, or official decree? It's a tempting thought. You imagine a stern judge slamming down his gavel, or more likely, his stick of sealing wax, demanding that a suspected adulteress be belted up as punishment, or a desperate nobleman pleading for a writ to safeguard his house. You picture the scribe recording every detail for posterity, right next to the lists of fines, the inventories of property, the confessions wrung out by torture. It's a story begging to be written. But as you flip through the dusty pages, you quickly realize the chastity belt is conspicuously absent from the archives. This is your mainstream historical fact for the section among the hundreds of thousands of surviving medieval legal records, court cases, marriage contracts, church inquisitions, and household inventories. Not a single one credibly documents the mandated use of a chastity belt. Not for punishment, not for fidelity, not even for a little extra marital insurance. The silence is as profound as a monastery at midnight. Laws dealt with inheritance, dowries, breaches of promise, paternity disputes, but never with locks and iron bands. Instead, what you do find is fascinating in its own right. Legal control of women's sexuality was real, but it was wielded through social tools: shaming, gossip, public penance, even banishment. There were laws against adultery, yes, and punishments for women and men caught in the act, but those punishments were usually fines, whipping, or in severe cases, imprisonment. The idea of solving the problem with a physical device was frankly too crude for most courts. Trust, once broken, wasn't repaired by a blacksmith. It was litigated, compensated, or simply whispered about until the end of days. You let your mind wander to the inquisitors, those grim officials charged with rooting out sin and scandal. The medieval Inquisition kept meticulous records, detailing everything from heresy to blasphemy, sexual misconduct to magical charms. Surely, you think, if chastity belts were ever imposed, these zealous investigators would have noted it, if only as a cautionary tale. But the inquisitors, for all their creativity, never mentioned belts. They were more interested in confessions and penance than in metalwork. They sought to correct souls, not confine bodies. Now and then, you stumble across a tantalizing phrase in a court record: "She was kept under watchful guard," or "He trusted not his house, but the loyalty of his wife." These lines speak of anxiety, not iron. Even when there are allusions to girdles of chastity, they're almost always metaphorical, a reference to piety, not hardware. The few times belts do appear in the legal documents, they're about clothing, dowries, or the ceremonial dress of nobility, not restraint. Let's pause for a historical aside. Real medieval law was obsessed with lineage, legitimacy, and property. If a child was born during a husband's absence, the resulting scandal could lead to years of lawsuits, family feuds, or outright war. But the solutions were legalistic: oaths, witness statements, annulments. The myth of the chastity belt fits right into this world as a fantasy of certainty, a way to guarantee fidelity when the courts and the church could only offer probabilities. The law, however, wanted proof, not props. As you leaf through the pages, a pattern emerges. The belt is always missing from the scene of the crime. Adulterers are caught in the act or denounced by jealous rivals, but there's never a mention of a lock, a key, or a device as evidence. No spouse ever presents a belt in court to prove innocence or to claim damages for a lost key. The entire apparatus exists only in the realm of rumor and innuendo. You imagine a medieval lawyer trying to introduce a chastity belt as evidence in a trial. The judge, unimpressed, might ask, was the device witnessed by honorable men? Was the key ever lost? Could the lady not remove it herself? The answers, inevitably, would lead back to trust, not technology. Even when you turn to the wildest legal disputes, the ones where families fought over every last coin, you find the same pattern. Women's reputations were policed by words, not iron. If a woman was accused of unfaithfulness, her accusers would present witnesses, not contraptions. The proceedings played out in public, but the evidence was always social, never mechanical. Here's a running joke from the archives. Why did the lawyer refuse to accept the chastity belt as evidence? Because he couldn't find a single witness who'd managed to unlock it. It's a line that would have killed in a medieval tavern, even as the scribes rolled their eyes. Sometimes you'll see stories about girdles or belts pop up in later legal records, but these are almost always misunderstandings or willful embellishments by Victorian antiquarians, desperate to spice up the past. They scoured old inventories for anything that could be interpreted as a device of restraint and then retold the story with a twinkle in their eye and a flair for the dramatic. You turn to the criminal codes and punishments, hoping for one last scrap of evidence. Torture existed, iron cages, stocks, manacles, but these were public and intended to shame. The chastity belt, by contrast, was private, secret, almost theatrical in its imagined cruelty. You suspect that if any were ever used, it would have been for a very short time, perhaps as a momentary lesson, rather than a sustained regime. Before you leave, you pass through the archives of city councils, guilds, and rural manor courts. Everywhere the rules are explicit about theft, murder, poaching, and marital infidelity, but nowhere do you see the law mandating, or even hinting at, enforced chastity through physical means. If anything, the obsession with reputation, the endless gossip, the careful arrangements of marriages, the ritual of public reconciliation were more effective and far more enduring than any belt. You pause at a clerk's desk where a harried scribe, his hands stained with ink, jots down the week's disputes. He looks up and grins. If I had a coin for every jealous husband who asked for a belt, I'd have enough to buy a new quill and a bigger lock for my wine cellar. You share a laugh. The joke, as always, is on those who want certainty where none can be found. As you close the ledger and blow out the candle, you realize the chastity belt is a legal ghost, a device born not from statutes, but from the persistent, gnawing fear of betrayal. It flourishes where proof is impossible, and trust is always in short supply. And perhaps that's the real lesson. Some questions are so uncomfortable that we invent impossible answers just to avoid them. You walk out into the night, law books left behind, and glance over your shoulder one last time. The corridors of power are silent, but you hear a faint echo, the click of an imaginary lock, the whisper of an unsolved case, the laughter of lawyers and clerks who know that sometimes the law is the least likely place to find the truth. With a final grin, you remember tonight's courtroom joke. Why did the judge throw out the chastity belt case? Because it didn't have a leg to stand on. Onward now, to the private places, bedrooms and hearts, where the chastity belt myth found a more subtle, shadowy power, shaping lives not through iron but through imagination. You leave the heavy law tomes and flickering court candles behind, stepping softly now through the corridors of private homes, behind doors that never quite close all the way. This is the realm where most of life happens, messy, unrecorded, unscripted, and where the myth of the chastity belt, real or not, worked its subtlest magic. Here, under the hush of domestic lamps and the weight of silence, you search not for iron, but for the lingering traces of anxiety, secrecy, and the unspoken rules that governed intimacy in the Middle Ages. Imagine yourself in the sleeping chamber of a small manor house. Outside, a dog barks in the cold, and someone on night watch hurries past, boots scraping the gravel. Within, all is shadow and soft rustle, the whisper of linen, the faint click of a lockbox, the murmured prayers before sleep. You feel the tension. A woman waiting for her husband's return from a distant journey, the household quiet, but for the tick of the hours. Maybe she has heard stories of belts and keys, of jealousies that walk the halls like ghosts. But as you watch, you notice what's really at work here. Not iron, not law, but a kind of constant negotiation. Trust, suspicion, love, and loneliness play out with every word, every look. The chastity belt, for most people, is less an object than a shadow, a rumor, a what-if that shapes behavior from the inside out. It's a story told at the hearth, a warning whispered by grandmothers, a threat half-jokingly repeated by husbands who know deep down that the only real guard on anyone's heart is affection and habit. Let's anchor this with a historical fact. Intimate diaries, letters, and confessions from the later Middle Ages and Renaissance, when such documents begin to survive in greater numbers, are obsessed with fidelity, but never mention the actual wearing or use of chastity belts. They speak instead of longing, of temptation, of heartbreak and joy. Husbands and wives argue, reconcile, fall in and out of love, just as people do now. The spectre of the belt hovers in the margins, but it's almost always a joke, a fantasy, or a metaphor for trust too fragile to be named. Picture a winter's evening, the family gathered around the fire, a wandering minstrel, or a clever uncle might tell the tale of the crusader who belted up his wife before leaving, only to find the key stolen by a fox, or the blacksmith's daughter who slipped out of her bonds to meet her sweetheart in the hayloft. Laughter follows, but beneath it is something sharper, a quiet, shared understanding that love is always at risk and that no lock can truly keep it safe. You drift through these rooms, noting the 1,000 ways privacy and secrecy shape daily life. Lovers meet in gardens and corners, letters are passed by servants, glances are exchanged at church. The household is a place of both sanctuary and surveillance. Mothers teach their daughters the subtle art of self-defense, not with iron but with wit, charm and caution. Fathers warn their sons that suspicion, like poison, can destroy what it means to trust. There is always talk of keys, but the keys that matter are the ones to hearts and minds. A running joke in such homes. Why did Lady Cecily always keep 3 keys on her girdle? One for her chest, one for her door, and one for her husband's imagination. The laughter is rueful, and you sense it has been told 100 times, always with a sideways glance at the youngest daughter. In these private spaces, the myth of the chastity belt morphs into something gentler, sometimes a way to tease, sometimes a way to threaten, often a way to reassure. When a wife gives her husband a ribbon from her gown, it means more than any lock. When a husband entrusts his wife with the keys to the pantry and the family silver, it's a sign of respect, not control. Still, the anxiety is real. You step into a kitchen, the warmth and noise a welcome contrast to the tense hush of the bedroom. Here, the gossip is thick as stew. A servant claims she once saw a belt of iron in her cousin's village, but the details are vague and the punchline is always the same. It rusted through before the husband came home. Everyone laughs, and the story is added to the pile of household legends. The cat that caught a mouse in the flour bin, the ghost that rattled the pantry doors. In such tales, the chastity belt is a stand-in for all the uncertainties of love and absence. It's easier to talk about locks and keys than about longing, loneliness, or mistrust. The belt becomes a story parents tell to scared daughters, a punchline in the game of courtship, a whispered explanation for a neighbor's too early baby. It's a way of making sense of the unpredictable, of putting a tidy frame around life's messiest feelings. But for every tale of anxiety, there is a tale of cunning. You listen to the stories told by older women, their voices low and sly. They know all the tricks, the ways a clever girl can foil a lock, the signals sent with a glance, the secret spaces in a busy household. In their telling, the chastity belt becomes not a prison but a puzzle, another challenge in the eternal contest between rules and rebellion. You picture a young bride, homesick and clever, finding her own ways to shape her life. Maybe she hides a letter beneath her pillow, or keeps a token from a childhood friend. Maybe she wears her keys on a ribbon, more for show than for use. In these acts, the myth of the belt loses its power. Love and loyalty, it turns out, are never really enforced. They're negotiated, chosen, sometimes lost, sometimes reclaimed. Another historical anchor, the actual objects that survive from the Middle Ages, girdles, belts, keys, are nearly always ceremonial or decorative, not functional restraints. Some are gifts exchanged at weddings, inscribed with mottos about love and trust. Others are tokens of status, worn for special occasions, as much about fashion as about fidelity. The iron belt, in its harshest form, is almost nowhere to be found. What endures are the softer bonds, ribbons, rings, promises. You wander into the garden at dusk. The air scented with rosemary and lavender. Lovers slip past, careful but not afraid. The myth of the chastity belt lingers here, but only as a shadow, a story told for effect. The real work of intimacy is quieter, less visible. The shared chores, the late-night talks, the small acts of kindness or cruelty that build a life. At the edge of the garden, 2 women sit together, sewing. One tells a story of her cousin's friend who outwitted a suspicious husband with nothing more than a smile and a clever servant. The other laughs and says, "Trust is the only belt worth wearing." You think as you listen that this is probably the deepest truth you'll find tonight. Before you go, here's the evening's household joke. Why did the Lord's wife hide the pantry key? So she'd have something to bargain with at breakfast. The moon rises, lighting your path back through the shadowy house. As you leave, you realize the legend of the chastity belt, for all its iron and spectacle, was always a story about what happens behind closed doors. A story of longing, of trust, of laughter in the face of fear, and maybe that's why it endures. You slip quietly from the warmth of flickering hearths and private gardens, finding yourself on the winding streets of a city reborn. It is the dawn of the Renaissance, where art and invention have begun to transform the old stories into something altogether more alluring, and sometimes more absurd. The chastity belt follows you here too, but its shape has shifted. Now it reappears in paintings, woodcuts, and witty allegories, no longer the whispered rumor of anxious households, but a vivid motif for artists with a keen eye for metaphor and spectacle. You wander through a bustling Florentine workshop. The air is sharp with the scent of turpentine and oil, the walls crowded with half-finished portraits and mythic scenes. A young apprentice, paint-stained and grinning, points out a curious detail in a new work. A figure part goddess, part mischief, wearing an ornate girdle studded with tiny keys and locks. "See," he winks, "even the angels need protection these days." You laugh, but you know he's only half joking. The chastity belt by the Renaissance had become a rich symbol for all manner of human anxieties: desire, possession, purity, and temptation. Let's ground this in a mainstream historical fact. Renaissance artists and writers were fascinated by allegory. The chastity belt appeared in their works less as a real object, and more as a playful or pointed symbol, a prop in tales of courtly love, a warning in fables, a visual pun in satirical prints, in paintings and engravings from Venice to Paris. You see Venus, the goddess of love, sometimes depicted with a locked girdle or a discarded belt nearby, an emblem as much about longing as about restraint. You pause in front of a woodcut by a German master dated around 1540. In it, a proud husband displays an enormous iron belt, while a clever wife winks at a locksmith, slipping her a second key. The joke is obvious, the moral clear: trust is never absolute, and love will always find its own way around the rules. The crowd at the market where the print is sold bursts into laughter, each person reading the scene through their own private lens, some with scandalized gasps, others with knowing grins. The Renaissance, after all, was an age of invention, of locks and keys, yes, but also of clever escapes, coded messages, and the subtle art of misdirection. The chastity belt became a symbol that was endlessly adaptable. Satirists used it to lampoon jealous husbands and meddling priests. Playwrights turned it into the centerpiece of bawdy comedies, and poets, especially those with a taste for the risque, wrote verses about love's ability to outwit any attempt at control. You sit in on a boisterous salon, where philosophers and artists debate whether virtue can truly be imposed from without. A locked heart is still a restless heart. One sighs, and the rest nod in agreement. Someone raises a glass and recites, "Better a trusting fool than a clever jailer." The toast is met with applause, the sentiment echoed by all present. But there's another side to the Renaissance. Chastity belt too. In an era fascinated by anatomy and invention, a few ambitious souls did attempt to design secure girdles. If only as curiosities, you find a drawing in a battered notebook, a fantastical device, bristling with hinges and spikes, complete with elaborate instructions. The note in the margin reads, "For the entertainment of my patrons only." It's all in good fun, a testament to the era's delight in mechanical marvels and human foibles. This light-hearted treatment was not universal, of course. Some writers, anxious about the supposed decline of morals, invoke the chastity belt as a symbol of what they saw as the lost innocence of earlier times. In their laments, The belt became a kind of cautionary ghost, a relic of a more orderly, if less joyful age. Yet even in these sermons and tracts, the device is rarely described in practical terms. It is a signpost for nostalgia and worry, not a real answer to the challenges of love and fidelity. You move through the crowded streets of Venice, lanterns reflecting on the canals. Lovers whisper on bridges, slipping rings and ribbons rather than keys. The shops are filled with trinkets, tiny padlocks, mock girdles, engraved mottos, sold not as instruments of restraint, but as tokens for courtship games and festival jokes. The legend of the chastity belt here is as much about the possibilities of liberation as the threat of imprisonment. Let's end with a typical quip from a Florentine wit. Why did the painter's wife never wear a belt? Because she preferred the key to his heart and to his wine cellar. The laughter that follows is easy and untroubled. In this new world of Renaissance art and allegory, the chastity belt is part of the scenery, colourful, curious, and far less intimidating than the heavy iron of legend. You slip away as the city settles for the night, the lights dimming and the laughter fading. In your pocket you carry a tiny token, a painted key, a reminder that sometimes the real locks and keys are the ones we imagine for ourselves, and that art, more than iron, shapes what we believe. Onward now to meet the collectors and scholars who would, centuries later, chase the chastity belt across time, not for love or laughter, but for the sake of curiosity, and sometimes for the thrill of a well-crafted lie. You find yourself surrounded by dusty shelves and glass-fronted cabinets, far from the bustling markets and witty salons of the Renaissance. Now you're in a collector's study, a den of obsession, ambition, and just a bit of historical mischief. Here the chastity belt is no longer a symbol or a punchline, but a prized trophy for the learned and the curious. Antiquarians, early archaeologists, and Victorian showmen all want their piece of the myth, and they're willing to bend the rules or the truth to get it. It's the 18th and 19th centuries, and the world has caught a fever for all things medieval. In the age of Romanticism, Gothic novels and grand historical paintings, there's no greater prize than an object that promises a glimpse of the wild past. And so, you watch as scholars and adventurers scour old castles, monasteries and city cellars in search of relics, chalices, swords, and inevitably chastity belts. The rarer and stranger, the better. An iron belt, heavy with locks and legend, is worth more than gold to the right collector. A quick fact, your anchor for this section. Most chastity belts displayed in museums or private collections were acquired or discovered in the 18th and especially 19th centuries, a time when the market for medieval curios was at its peak. The authenticity of these finds was often questionable, but the hunger for spectacle made provenance a secondary concern. You slip between shelves, fingers tracing spines of crumbling catalogues and auction ledgers. You pause at an exhibit, a chastity belt, engraved and ornately wrought, displayed as a medieval treasure. But the closer you look, the more modern the details appear. The lock is stamped with the mark of a Victorian locksmith. The hinges are in a style fashionable in 1850, not 1450. Still, visitors gawk and shudder, eager for a whiff of scandal. Antiquarians swap stories at smoky clubs and learned societies. One brags about his authentic collection of torture devices, another winks and admits to commissioning a local smith to restore a recent find, meaning, of course, to make it more dramatic. You hear tales of dealers adding extra locks or rust, of inventing provenance to fetch a higher price at auction. Some even go further. A few forgeries are outright fabrications, built from scratch to satisfy the appetite for medieval horror. You move through the archives reading letters from early museum directors and collectors. Some are guileless, swept up in the excitement of new finds. Others are canny, more interested in what sells than what's true. A curator at a London museum writes, "The public expects a story, let us give it to them." Another in Vienna admits privately that his chastity belt is a conversation piece, more effective at drawing crowds than at teaching history. For the most devoted collectors, the chastity belt becomes almost a fetish object, not in the salacious sense, but in the anthropological one. They believe, or say they believe, that possessing such an item brings them closer to the gritty truth of the past. The belt is evidence, they insist, of a darker, more brutal world, a time when suspicion and control ruled every aspect of daily life. But there are always skeptics. In the back rooms of museums, you hear quiet debates. Some experts point to the lack of mention in genuine medieval sources. Others raise an eyebrow at the suspicious uniformity of many authentic belts. More than a few note that almost every well-documented example can be traced back to a collector or dealer in the 1800s. Not to any medieval household or church. Even among the honest, there's a kind of winking complicity. As one 19th century curator confides in his diary, if the public insists on monsters, who are we to deny them a glimpse? The chastity belt then becomes not just a relic, but a story crafted, curated, and sometimes outright invented for the thrill of a scandalous past. You attend an auction in Paris, the room buzzing with excitement. A belt goes on the block, bidding fierce. The catalogue promises a genuine artifact of the Crusades, discovered in a secret chamber beneath a ruined abbey. You and the auctioneer exchange knowing glances. The winner leaves satisfied, clutching a piece of history that may be no older than his own walking stick. The story has a darkly comic undertone. For every honest scholar, there are two more eager to embellish. The myth grows with every new discovery, until the line between fact and forgery is hopelessly blurred. And yet, as you leave the collector's den, you realize the real power of the chastity belt is not in its metal, but in the passion it stirs. Part curiosity, part mischief, part longing for a world that probably never was. Before you slip away, you hear the latest collector's joke. Why did the antiquarian keep 3 chastity belts on his mantle? One for love, one for luck, and one for the price of admission. You step back into the light, the echoes of sales and secrets fading, ready to see how the chastity belt would change again, this time reborn for a modern age as cartoon, comedy, and symbol in a world that loves nothing better than a racy story with just a hint of truth. You step through the swinging doors of the 20th century, out of the collector's lamplit den and straight onto the garish stage of pop culture. The chastity belt, polished and paraded for centuries as a trophy of supposed medieval madness, now finds itself caught in the bright glare of cartoons, films, stand-up routines, and novelty shops. You realize with a grin, the old iron relic has become less a tool of terror, more an icon of playful taboo, endlessly reinvented for laughs and shock value. Here on this new stage, the chastity belt is everywhere and nowhere. You walk into a movie house in the 1930s, the screen flickers, and there's a hapless knight, key dangling from his belt, fumbling with a locked-up maiden. The joke is always the same. Love and lust are forces that no lock can truly hold back. The audience howls as the key goes missing, found at the worst possible moment by a clever page or a nosy pet. The chastity belt, once a symbol of suspicion, is now pure slapstick. You can trace this pop culture resurrection across decades. In the golden age of cartoons, Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck snatch keys, outwit guards, and use cartoon chastity belts as punchlines for schemes and mishaps. The real danger is always to the ego, never to the body. The device becomes a prop for comedy, sometimes bawdy, sometimes innocent, always exaggerated. Let's anchor this section with your mainstream historical fact. By the early 20th century, the chastity belt was widely debunked as a serious historical artifact. Even so, its myth had become too good to die. Instead, it was adopted by the emerging worlds of film, advertising, and consumer novelty, reimagined again and again as a symbol of outdated prudery and farcical control. You flip through pulp magazines from the 1950s, where the chastity belt pops up in risque cartoons and joke columns. The tone is knowing, a wink to readers who pride themselves on their modern, liberated views. Advertisements for gag gifts appear. Faux belts, plastic locks, even tiny key-shaped chocolates for Valentine's Day. The message is clear. This is a story everyone knows. even if nobody believes it anymore. You stop by a stand-up club in the 1970s, smoky and crowded. The comedian saunters on stage, brandishing an authentic chastity belt and quipping, "This is what happens when your mother-in-law visits for a month." Laughter erupts. The device is now a shorthand for all things awkward in love, a symbol of boundaries no one truly respects. On television, variety shows and sitcoms trot out the belt for easy gags. A jealous husband appears, ready to lock up his wife's virtue. She, of course, has the spare key all along. The real punchline is always about trust or the lack thereof. Sometimes the chastity belt is reimagined as a device for husbands, the tables turned and the joke gently aimed at male anxieties. You wander into a novelty shop, the shelves bursting with gag gifts. Among the fake dog poo and rubber chickens, chastity belts are miniature and harmless. Keychains, bottle openers, lacy undergarments with tiny padlocks sewn on. The myth is now part of the carnival of everyday life, a joke shared among friends at bachelorette parties and stag nights. Even wedding cakes sometimes feature plastic belts as a wink at the old story, but pop culture's fascination goes deeper than just laughter. The chastity belt becomes a metaphor for all sorts of boundaries, sexual, social, even technological. In science fiction, chastity fields and virtue circuits riff on the medieval myth, asking what new forms control might take in an age of machines. In romantic comedies, the belt stands for old-fashioned hang-ups, inevitably shed as love triumphs, and the characters find freedom. A joke for tonight: why did the superhero refuse to wear a chastity belt? Because even kryptonite can't stop a determined heart. The crowd always laughs, because as ever, everyone knows the truth is less about metal and more about the comedy of human desire. Through all these pop culture permutations, the chastity belt never quite shakes its origins. There's always an echo of something darker, a memory of the old anxieties about trust, fidelity, and control, but each retelling softens the edges until the belt is no longer a threat, but an invitation to laugh at our own insecurities. You flip through a graphic novel where a heroine uses her wits and a bobby pin to outsmart an evil villain's virtue trap. In the next panel, she tosses the belt aside, victorious and smiling. The moral is clear: freedom wins, and control is always in the end a bit ridiculous. In modern music too, the motif appears. Pop singers drop lines about locking it up or finding the key, always with a playful twist. The belt, once a device for policing women, now becomes a symbol that anyone can claim, subvert, or discard. As you walk home through the neon-lit streets, you realize that chastity belt's latest role is as a relic of bad advice, a joke about how not to do love. The world, it seems, is finally in on the secret. What was once sold as safety is now nothing more than a reminder that laughter is the best defense against fear. Onward now, to the thinkers and activists who have taken the chastity belt story in hand, determined to unravel its meanings, and to free it, once and for all, from the rusty chains of You drift from the glare of television screens and neon-lit novelty shops into the thoughtful calm of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, where old stories are held up to the light and asked, sometimes for the first time, what they really mean. Here, the chastity belt is no longer just a punchline or a museum curiosity, but a subject of serious debate, feminist critique, and historical revision. The iron at last is being pried open, link by link, not by locksmiths or collectors, but by scholars, activists, and anyone who's ever wondered who really benefits from keeping a legend alive. You join a circle of historians in a sunlit seminar room, books and coffee cups scattered across the table. They're not here to gawk at curiosities, but to challenge the narrative. The chastity belt, one says, is a myth about control, not an artifact of real life. Another chimes in, it's a story told about women, not by women, and that matters. Their conversation is lively, full of references to primary sources, critical theory, and the social forces that shape memory as much as metal. You realize, as you listen, that this reappraisal is a revolution of sorts, a pushback against centuries of sensationalism, against the easy assumption that women in the past were forever the victims of male suspicion and cruelty. Instead, these scholars see the chastity belt as a kind of cultural shorthand, a fable that says more about the anxieties of the people who repeated it than about the realities of medieval or Renaissance life. Here's your historical anchor. By the 1990s, leading feminist historians like Sarah Bernhardt and others had traced the chastity belt myth's rise, fall, and curious persistence. They revealed that most medieval examples were, in fact, Victorian inventions. The original references were satirical or metaphorical, not practical. In study after study, evidence of widespread use in the Middle Ages simply evaporates under scrutiny. This shift in perspective matters. In classrooms and books, in podcasts and online forums, the chastity belt has become a case study in how history is shaped, not just by what survives, but by who gets to tell the story. For centuries, men wrote about controlling women's bodies. Now women and many men write about how those stories serve to excuse distrust and justify inequality. The chastity belt becomes a symbol of the ways in which myths are used to reinforce social norms and of the courage it takes to question them. You attend a panel at a history conference where an activist historian reads a satirical letter from a 14th century wife to her absent husband. It ends, "You left me with keys, belts, and rules, but you forgot that trust was the only thing worth keeping locked away." The room erupts in applause. It's a powerful moment, one that recasts the belt as a metaphor for all the restrictions, visible and invisible, that have been placed on women for centuries. In the world of art and performance too, the chastity belt is reclaimed and reinterpreted. You visit an exhibition where contemporary artists use replica belts, made of velvet, glass, or even light, to challenge viewers' assumptions about gender and agency. Some pieces are angry, some playful, some tender. One sculpture is simply a ribbon tied in a bow with the inscription, "Unlocked by choice." Writers and filmmakers pick up the theme, spinning stories that subvert the old legend. In one novel, a heroine outsmarts not just the belt, but the whole society that believes in it. In another, the belt is a family heirloom, kept not as a threat, but as a reminder to never let fear rule the heart. Online memes abound. "I locked up my anxiety, not my body," reads one, a wry twist on a myth that has outlived its usefulness. Even in everyday conversation, you hear the shift. The phrase chastity belt is invoked less as a warning and more as a critique of double standards, of outdated norms, of the ways we sometimes police ourselves. It's become a shorthand for all the things we're told to accept for our own good, and a rallying cry to ask, who is really being protected? Here's the latest joke as told at a feminist book club. Why did the chastity belt finally break? Because it was no match for an open mind and a decent Wi-Fi connection. Yet, the story isn't all irony and critique. There's a sense of relief, even gratitude, that the truth is less brutal than the myth. Many find comfort in learning that medieval women, for all the hardships they faced, were not as universally shackled as legend once insisted. There's a new respect for the ingenuity, resilience, and agency of women past and present, who always found ways to bend the rules, subvert expectations, and when necessary, slip the lock. As the seminar draws to a close, you watch as students pack up their books, a little lighter for having left behind an old fear. The chastity belt remains, on display in story, in symbol, but it's no longer a chain. It's a question mark, an invitation to look deeper, and a reminder that the truest stories are the ones we keep revisiting, challenging and rewriting together. And with that, you step out into the sunlight, the myth at your back, and prepare to face the final question. Why does this story still haunt us? Why does the chastity belt, long after its locks have rusted away, still hold a place in the crowded attic of our imagination? You step gently into the quiet after the storm of arguments, jokes, and revelations. The world outside is modern now, brimming with screens, voices, and more stories than anyone could count. Yet somehow, through all these centuries of change, the legend of the chastity belt still clings to the edges of our imagination, a ghost at the feast, forever just out of reach. You wander through this mental attic, brushing aside old cobwebs, sifting through the relics of past anxieties and desires, wondering, why does the chastity belt endure, long after history itself has debunked it? There's a peculiar comfort in stories with sharp edges, tales that warn and thrill in equal measure. The chastity belt is one of these, a fable about control, trust, longing, and the danger of believing there's any simple fix for human hearts. It's a story that flatters our cynicism, look how far we've come, yet feeds our fascination with power and its abuses. In movies, cartoons, even children's books and internet memes, the belt remains a punchline, a metaphor, an artifact for a world that likes its monsters simple and its lessons clear. You pause in front of a classroom where a teacher holds up a picture. "Was this really used?" she asks. The students lean in, eyes wide. Some laugh, some shudder, some roll their eyes. And in their reaction, you see why the myth lasts. The chastity belt is, above all, a conversation starter. It gives us permission to talk about what we fear. Jealousy, betrayal, the limits of love, and what we desire, safety, loyalty, intimacy, freedom. The iron may have rusted, but the questions have not. Let's ground this in your final historical fact. Folklorists and psychologists agree that persistent legends, even false ones, survive because they answer emotional needs. The chastity belt, with its mixture of scandal and reassurance, allows us to project anxieties onto the past, while quietly congratulating ourselves for living in more enlightened times. In reality, of course, the struggle between trust and control, between self-doubt and self-determination, remains as alive as ever. As you move through this imaginary museum, you notice that every generation remakes the myth to fit its own worries. The Victorians used it to gawk at supposed medieval cruelty. 20th century comedians wielded it to lampoon prudery. Feminist historians and activists cracked it open, exposing its emptiness and asking harder questions. And in a final twist, pop culture reclaimed it for camp, comedy, and endless memes. You realize, too, that the chastity belt myth endures precisely because it can never be settled once and for all. It's too useful, too adaptable, too full of shadow and possibility. It's a legend that lets us measure ourselves against the imagined follies of the past, while gently reminding us that every age has its own cages, locks, and keys. Real or metaphorical, you stand at the threshold now, the old stories behind you, the road ahead open and unguarded. You know there will be new myths, new debates, new ways to laugh at and learn from the tangled histories we inherit. The chastity belt, real or not, has done its work, not to control bodies, but to spark imagination, provoke reflection, and maybe, just maybe, make us a little more skeptical about the simple answers to life's most complicated questions. Before you drift away, tonight's closing joke: why do historians love the chastity belt? Because it unlocks more questions than answers, every single time. And with that, your long, winding journey is nearly complete. Now, as the last echoes of keys and laughter fade, your breath slows and the world seems softer, wrapped in velvet darkness. The sharp lines of history blur, the clatter and chatter fall away. You let yourself rest in the gentle truth that most fears are smaller by morning, and that every tale, no matter how tangled, ends in silence and peace. Feel your muscles grow heavy. Let your thoughts float free. Picture the stories of tonight as distant lanterns, flickering out one by one, their glow gentle, never harsh. You've wandered centuries, peeked behind locked doors, and learned that what we imagine often reveals more than what we find. In this hush, you need only be present. No need for locks, no need for keys, only a quiet heart, safe and at ease. Let your mind drift beyond iron and rumor, beyond suspicion and myth, into a warmth that is wholly your own. Breathe deep and slow. Trust the night to hold you. Know that you are unguarded, unworried, and entirely free, no matter what legends try to linger. Thank you for sharing this unraveling with me here on Historian's Diary. May the weight slip away, and may sleep find you smiling in a world where only dreams are allowed to wander. Dream.